Hello and welcome to Bold Leadership. I'm Colin Pooler, your co-host, and along with Kavis Reed, we're dedicated to the discussions of leadership. We have entertaining conversations on the challenges, learnings, ups and downs, and fundamentals of leadership. Our podcast involves interviews with people across the spectrum of business, public policy, community, athletics, and across a whole range of ages. So enjoy along with us, every guest and every conversation we have. Laugh a little bit, and don't worry, you don't have to be bald to enjoy it.
Today's guest is Mr. Perrin Beatty, former cabinet ministers for multiple portfolios under 3 prime ministers, former CBC chief executive officer, and currently the chief executive officer for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce.
The starting point is vision. You have to have a clear sense of what it is. Where does you want to go? And that certainly applies for anybody in politics, but it applies for business as well. As you're choosing your staff, as you're choosing people to work around you, your starting point should be choose people who are smarter than you are. Look at that directly. He said if you can do the job of any of the people that you have there in your staff working with you better than they can, you have the wrong person. And if your starting point is empathy and understanding and respect, then you'll be surprised by what the results are.
Listen as we have a conversation about his journey through leadership and his journey through leading organizations through major cultural change.
You said you were just on with the Globe and Mail.
Yeah.
Well, I had a television interview a couple of hours ago as well for announcement. So I had to look really good.
That's easier for you than it is for me.
And for me as well. So.
Well, Perrin, one of the things I got to tell you right off the bat, what I appreciate is that you've attempted to meet the dress code for today, or the hair code, I should put it that way. So we had Pamela Wallin, Senator Wallin on.
I caught part of that.
Oh, okay. And she immediately said she wasn't going to adhere to the code at all. So I thought,
As I recall, I believe her sister was a hairdresser.
Yes. That's right. Yeah.
One little bit,
Yes.
Yeah, she said her and her sister had actually bought the salon in her town. She's done a lot of things. I was just like,
remarkable, and she's a good person. She was, where was it? We were at dinner for the Canada West Foundation a couple of nights ago. Pam was at that as well, so it was great to see her.
Good. And we had
I think at the airport or on one of the planes I was on last week, so we're sort of following each other around.
Well, so first of all, thank you. And I know you haven't met Kavis yet, but Kavis Reed, Perrin Beatty.
Kavis is a real
Pleasure is mine as well. Thank you so very much, sir.
And you were very patient waiting for me to get my tech up and running.
Oh no! This is nothing, Perrin, in terms of having to practice patience. Whether it's Kavis and I have been complaining to each other about car issues and winter, and so patience we've been practicing for a long time.
Well, and during COVID, I've been doing a series of video podcasts, if you like, or at least attaching it to our website, interviews with business leaders, and they go on for about 25 minutes, and we do it via Zoom. And more than once, when you have Mr. CEO running a bank or whatever, afterward I had to call up and say, "Oh, I forgot to push the record button." Really working at this, and this idiot who was interviewing him just forgot to push the button. We had a very good conversation, nonetheless.
Well, hey, would you mind doing this again, please?
I'm doing nothing else, no problem.
Oh, well, it's that's funny. Well, my story, which my wife is. Everyone says she's so nice. Like her whole life, your wife is so nice, and she is. But I also have to say, well, you have to kind of know her outside of, like I see more of her but she could be a bit witty and sarcastic too, but only in this sense, because I know she's going to listen to this. I don't want to get into some trouble. But I came home, the day before yesterday. Came home. My wife and I chatted for a little bit, and she said she's going to go to her mom's just to work on help her work on some things. I said, okay, that's great. I was rather tired, so I decided I'm going to turn in early, and so I turned early. I fell asleep. I get up very early in the morning, Perrin, to go and work out before I go to the office. And so I get up the next morning, and on the counter is a bag of rice with a note on it. And so I look at the note, and it says, "I dropped my phone in the toilet." So, the trick where you stick it in a bag of rice to see if you could dry it out before you turn. So I thought, oh, okay. So I left it, and I went to work, and I went to the gym, went to work. And a few hours later, I get an email just saying, "Oh, just so you know, my phone's not working. I don't have it with me. So if you want to reach me, maybe email me." And I thought, okay, that's fine. And so I don't remember if I made a mocking remark or something like that, but a little later in the day, I get a second email that said, "Oh, by the way, we're having meatballs and rice for supper." And guess what we had when I got home for supper? There was meatballs. So, of course, I checked to see, no, don't worry, the bag of rice that was originally there was
the woman who was prepared to take revenge.
Just when we think we're smart enough.
Yeah, I thought, I need to, I'm going to have to be careful of this. So we had a good laugh. We had some meatballs and rice. So that was my, by the way, the phone doesn't work anymore. So I've, it's sat in there for 2 days. I think it's time for another phone. It's a goner. And,
but she could have you pay for the phone now.
Oh yeah. No problem there. No problem. As long as I get fed and it's not the rice, that I'm really got to keep an eye on this. And she did explain the water was clean water, but it fell into the toilet at her mother's place. So
well, you probably would have done better with that than you would have eating at my place. I'm the family cook, and my line had always been with people coming over, you don't have to worry because it's been over 2 years since the last person had to rushed to emergency. But I've got to be careful of that now because I food poisoned myself badly a month ago. And just whack, I've never been so sick in my life. And I think anybody's going to be afraid to touch my food for the next while.
Well, the days since last injury sign that we often see in manufacturing site, you have to reset it to 0 days.
In 0 days.
I've never felt so bad in my life as I did here. And the bizarre thing was that Julie ate the same food as I did. She was fine. Go figure.
Okay, and you didn't get... She's either tougher or there's something else going on.
Then the last time, you may be right about that. The last time that we had people over was New Year's Eve. We were down in Florida.
Okay.
And so we had Canadian friends over for dinner. I cooked the dinner. It wasn't a terribly good job that I had done, but everybody ate. Then I woke up on New Year's Day feeling punk. Did a COVID test, and I had to call everybody who had been at dinner with us the night before to inform them, happy 2023, I've just tested positive for COVID. Again, neither Julie nor anybody else who was there caught it. It was just me. So it may be that I have a death wish. It's just coming out in different ways.
Just double check your insurance to see if there had been changes that you didn't.
Check on that.
Yeah, Kavis, I have had the opportunity to meet Perrin's wife, Julie, back in October. Lovely lady. So I can't imagine that she would actually do that to you. So I'm going to try to keep you in the clear for a while, Perrin. So, but well, for For everybody who's listening to this podcast, welcome to Bald Leadership. I'm Colin Pillar, the co-host, Kavis Reed, and today we've got the privilege of having Perrin Beatty with us, and Perrin is he's got such a distinguished background.
Worrisome when you start to laugh when you say that.
Well, but it is. I don't know many people that been. You started in had a manufacturing background. I'm going to try to play this back and see, and you can tell me if I got it right or if you want to make something else up. But manufacturing background. If your family's been involved in manufacturing for a lot of years, and then elected federally and at a fairly young age, and been in cabinet for 3 prime ministers, if I got this right, and from Joe Clark to Brian Mulroney, kept a number of portfolios, and with Kim Campbell, and then politely I could say you left politics, sort of, or left you. And then once you become the CEO for Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, and then back as an executive with Manufacturers Association, and then today is the Chief Executive Officer for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, which represents a couple 100,000 businesses across Canada. And so, Perrin, you've seen everything from international leadership to small local business leadership to leadership in terms of organizations, and then also just having the ability to interact with so many people. And I thought this would be kind of fun to have a conversation with you in a really relaxed setting. So,
Colin, that's what employers refer to as a checkered career, I found. Proof that if you have no discernible skills, you can't hold any one job.
So that's why I haven't been holding them.
Well, it's only checkered to me, I thought it was only checkered if I got pulled over and they say, "Hey, Mr. Polar, Kavis never really introduced that because Kavis, you've been involved with HR for a lot of years. You've seen this moving from job to job. Isn't that a symptom of something?
It's a symptom of the runaway husband, runaway bride, whatever you want to call it, runaway groom. You just can't settle your feet down. What do they say down south? Rolling stone gathers no moss.
Well, the Kavis are really interested in exploring a few things. I thought you may be able to bring some perspective on your observations of leadership and then your own journeys of leadership over all these years, and then perhaps if it's okay, even just talking about some of the things that you and I have had the opportunity to meet the last couple of years, and which kind of the impact and legacy of leadership. I would really love to explore and ask your thoughts on a number of things. So, Kavis is jumping.
Really available. Is worth what you pay for it, Colin.
Well, Kavis, you have to jack up some prices here if we're going to make this into something.
We have an honorable person with a distinguished career in front of us talk to us. I think the ratings are going to go through the roof. I'm most intrigued when I look at his background and I see all the different types of leadership that he's had. It's intriguing, and it's also one of those things where you go, I want to just listen to his journey, his leadership journey, and how did it start for you, and what prompted you or motivated you to enter into the political arena and put yourself in the proverbial firing line to help people and guide people and lead? How did that story start, and do you mind taking us through that one?
Kavis, it started 10 years before I was elected to Parliament. I was 12. It was the 1962 election, and the great son of Saskatchewan, John Diefenbaker, was running for re-election as Prime Minister. I was raised in a small town called Fergus, Ontario, and it's about an hour. It's about an hour west of Toronto Airport in southern Ontario, just north of Guelph. And in those days, Fergus still had a movie theater. It was 25 cents to go and see a movie. And it was before the days of the malls or late night shopping or anything. And a friend of mine and I had gone to see a movie and had come out, and it being those days, all of the stores in downtown were closed. The lights were off, except there was one store with the lights on. And being curious 12-year-olds, we went and poked our head in the window to see who was in there, what was going on. Turned out the family lawyer was there and recognized me and beckoned us to come inside. Turned out to be the Progressive Conservative campaign headquarters for the 1962 election. And our family lawyer said, would you be willing to help out? So you could see the posters that I put up on lampposts, which are sort of 3 feet lower than anybody else's because I was only 12. But that's what got me involved in politics. After that, I would often be asked by people to say, you must have studied all of the political parties very closely and made a considered decision as to what to do about which party to join and so on. And my answer was, no, I actually happened to wander into, this was recognized by the family lawyer and who invited me to get involved, and that's how I started. It then became a fascination for me. Other kids had normal pursuits, such as playing hockey or football. I had this weird thing at 12 of being interested in politics. And then when I graduated from Western with a BA back in 1971, I took a year off. I was going to go sow wild oats or do something else. And then I was going to come back and do an MA and a PhD in Canadian history and teach, or I was going to do law as my brother had done, or I was going to enroll at the radio and television arts course at Ryerson, become a journalist. Instead, I ended up being a candidate within about 6 months and was elected to Parliament at 22. So in any group that I'm in, I'm usually the one who is the least educated in terms of formal education. But what a kick it's been, to have been a student of politics and then to be able to go down and actually participate in, to serve on the parliamentary committee that patriated the Constitution, or to serve as a member of cabinet, or to serve as a member of Parliament for 21 years was a tremendous privilege, and it was a great opportunity. And when we're talking about leadership, a great opportunity to see different styles of leadership that great leaders have, both in Canada and abroad, and to learn from them. So it's been a great education for me.
Excellent. In that arena, you had the opportunity, I think, to interact with 4 different prime ministers. Do people, what leadership characteristic did you see in all 4 of them? And do you see now in a lot of the high-profile leaders that you feel is one of the traits that you must have to lead at that level?
I had 4 leaders, but only 3 of them became prime ministers. I think that may be unique today in having served in the cabinets of 3 different Canadian prime ministers. And that was interesting to see that they each had different styles of how they managed cabinet. But Bob Stanfield was my first leader. He had been Premier of Nova Scotia before running for the leadership of the PC party. And he's often referred to as the best prime minister that Canada never had. He was an outstanding person. But I also watched prime ministers from across the floor. Pierre Trudeau initially, John Turner as well for a short time. And then from outside of politics, had a chance to watch Prime Minister Paul Martin and Prime Minister Chrétien and now the second Prime Minister Trudeau, and of course Stephen Harper. The first thing is obviously you have to have a passion for the country, and you have to feel that the commitment that you make is something that is worth the sacrifice that you make. We ask our prime ministers to put themselves on the line to make a great expense in terms of the time they would have with family, the private life, and so on. Everything that they do is under a microscope, but they have to feel as if there's a unique contribution that they can make to the country, and that this justifies all of the sacrifice they make. And I don't know any of those people I've mentioned who wouldn't say that they felt it was justified, and they felt privileged by having done that. And certainly, Kavis, during all the time that I was there, when I would walk as a cabinet minister, when I would walk out of the Parliament buildings at night, and much of that time Parliament sat at night until 11 o'clock, you'd walk out, you'd look back at the Peace Tower, the Parliament buildings, and a shiver would still go down my spine. And you would realize the great people who had served in that institution, MacDonald, Laurier, and others, and you would realize how privileged you were. It would give you a sense of humility, because you realize you were just a tenant in those offices. You had a lease. You didn't own it. And at some point, the office would go back to the people for someone else. I think outstanding prime ministers that I've worked with have had that understanding as well, that the time that they had to make a difference was limited. They had to use it well, and that they had to be driven by a passion to make a difference.
So I'm glad that you said that. Thank you. The one of the things that you said that is that I've been reflecting on here recently, and you touched on it again, is the role of being trustee when you're in leadership. You don't own this. It's not one of your possessions to be in leadership. You are entrusted. You're a tenant of an office, but it's because you are trusted with something, whether it be to lead others, to there are people who rely and rely on you and your decisions for their livelihood, for their career satisfaction, to help facilitate their contribution to society. And oftentimes, as we come through our development, it's easy to forget that. And we recently had a discussion with someone else who said, for a while there, I thought I was leading for me. I thought it was about my career, and then there was a pivot that they made where they realized it was about everybody else, and that success was for everybody else. And I know you've thought about this, because I've heard you on other things over the years. I had the privilege to either watch or listen. Would you be willing to dive a little deeper into that area in terms of being that trustee, if you will, in terms of an office?
I had a discussion after I was out of Parliament. I had a discussion with Keith Spicer, who used to be the editor of the Ottawa Citizen before any was official languages commissioner, but he had been in chair of the CRTC as well. And we were talking about what it's like to hold a high office and then to move beyond that. And Keith had a very interesting expression. He said, you realize you're wearing borrowed clothes and that they have to go back. And I thought it was a very good way of describing it. Again, an understanding that it's something that's temporary, and it's a great honor that you have, but an enormous responsibility that goes with it as well. A word that's fallen out of the fashion that tends to be used by religious groups much more than in general parlance is the word steward. When you're entrusted with an office, you are the steward of those responsibilities, and it's your job to ensure that the responsibilities you have for others are met effectively and compassionately and with understanding. And also that ultimately, at the end of the day, that when you return the office for someone else, that it's returned intact, that the democratic institutions that we serve are stronger rather than weaker, for example. And that the faith of the citizens or the faith of the people you're serving, whether it's your own employees, your colleagues, your customers, the voters, that they feel as if you've kept faith with them, and that they've been treated well in that. There was a big difference. I worry now about the challenges we have attracting good people into public life because of the enormous price that they pay, and because, let's look at the value proposition. You take a successful business person, and you say to them, look, you've done incredible things there in business, and it's going well, and you have the potential for building it even more. What I'd like you to do is to agree to leave your business and to take a significant cut in pay to run for office, and you'll be away from your family much of the time. You're lucky if you come up with your reputation intact. And because power has become so centralized in leaders' offices, even if you're a minister, it's questionable whether you'll have the ability to really run your own department and really make the decisions that are necessary. Not a very attractive value proposition for somebody who has a successful life somewhere else and whom we're asking to make these sacrifices. So that one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we attract the very best people into politics, and their motivation is the right motivation. When I first was elected in 1972, it was first of all filled with a sense of humility that the voters in my constituency would have elected a 22-year-old to represent them in Parliament. But beyond that, every event you went to, there was a sense that people had that they revered their elected representatives. They felt that they were honest, they were there to serve the public, and that there were people who were in it for others rather than for themselves. There's been a tremendous sea change in terms of the public's view of people in public life these days. And increasingly what you hear from ordinary citizens you talk to is they're suspicious of people in public life. They think their motivation is self-interest rather than the public interest. And the level of trust and regard that ordinary citizens have for their elected representatives has diminished enormously. I worry about that tremendously for a couple of reasons. The first is that it undermines the very foundations of our democracy. If people lose faith in our institutions and in the people representing them. The other is I worry about it because it makes it so much more difficult to attract the type of people that we want to have in public life. And a challenge for us is how do we restore that sense of civic confidence that we all want to achieve the same things, and that our elected representatives have the qualities that you were talking about, that they feel that sense of responsibility for the people that they're serving. And at the end of the day, that they never forget that that we're talking about service, not self-service, public service to the general public. And that in a democracy, single most important gift that the citizenry can give to you is the ability to represent them in elected office.
And you brought up several very good points. It is very tough to attract people in the leadership arena, basically because we live in an instant information world, and everyone's agenda is being pushed. And my grandfather always say, walk in a room with 100 people, 20 are not going to like it just because. And now we have a mechanism of making that dislike known internationally. How do you, can you reflect on a lot of the rewards you felt as a servant leader, as a steward, with the trust of thousands of people? What are some of the rewards that you have gained from this in terms of personal fulfillment, in terms of seeing results that can help some younger people see that civic service goes beyond just the public scrutiny? There are a lot of personal growth and values that you can take from the experience.
Kavis, let me start by disabusing anybody of the notion that this was all altruism on my part. I developed a passion for politics when I was 12. 10 years later, I had the privilege of serving in the government, in the Parliament of Canada. My hobby had become my first job, in essence. This was a tremendous high. It was a great privilege every day. And I had to pinch myself about how lucky I was. And looking back on it and asking myself, how qualified were you to do the job? I'd had very little life experience. I was nominated at 21. I hadn't had to pay a mortgage. I hadn't raised a family. I hadn't held a job. And yet the voters in my constituency had entrusted their well-being to me. It was a very humbling but energizing realization that you had been given that trust. So it was enormously rewarding. Then I was able to be there, and I still remember the first caucus I went to. I assumed that I would be told, "Okay, 22-year-old, you're here to be seen and not heard." So I was very noisy at that first caucus. That was the fact that I had arrived and wasn't going to be quiet. What I found was that Parliament is a meritocracy. My colleague's attitude was, look, you got here the same way as we did. You came in through the front door, and you're going to be judged not on the basis of how old you are, but how you perform. And I genuinely felt that the system was open and that I had a chance to make a contribution. And, one of the issues that people often have about party politics and about people who get elected to office, well, what's the trade-off belonging to a caucus or a political party and representing your constituents and your own conscience? For me, the important thing was if I felt that I'd had a chance to be heard and fairly heard by everybody, and at the end of the day, the consensus among my colleagues was to do something else, I felt comfortable going along with that consensus. And that was important. I represented a rural area, rural Canadians, rural and small town. Rural Canadians are in the minority in Canada. Most people are in the urban areas. It meant then if you had a system like this where you had a chance to persuade others based on the force of the arguments you were making, it meant that those of us from rural Canada potentially had an influence that we never could have had if it was simply vote on a very narrow basis without that sort of give and take with your colleagues, with the willingness to compromise. And so I felt doubly privileged to be able to work with colleagues where you could have that sort of a discussion. My leader as well, Bob Stanfield, was a remarkable person, and I once persuaded him to do a paper on what I referred to as progressive conservative philosophy. Well, he talked, among other things, about political parties and the role that they played. And when you look at Canada, there are enormous centrifugal forces that have always threatened to tear it apart. It could be regional, it could be demographic, it could be cultural, it could be religious, it could be racial, there could be any number of other things that pull at the national fabric. One of the roles that political parties should play is as an integrating function, to bring people together from very different backgrounds, different regions, different perspectives. And I don't have to tell people in Western Canada, for example, that Ottawa may look very different from Saskatoon as opposed to how it looks from Mississauga, and that solutions that are going to work in downtown Toronto aren't necessarily going to work in St. John's, Newfoundland, or in Labrador, and that what's the glue that holds our country together is compromise, goodwill, and a willingness to accommodate each other, as opposed to insisting on, I want what I want to have, either for my region only or for myself, and I'm not prepared to compromise. Political parties and our elected representatives, if they do their job well, the first function needs to be, how do we hold this incredible country together? How do we bring people together? And how do we find a way in which everybody's voice has a place and is heard? So for me, it was fascinating. It was something I learned early from my colleagues in Parliament. The other thing that I learned that was shocking to me is I had, and again, this may sound very strange to you, but I had been born and raised, I grew up in southern Ontario. I went to high school in in Toronto, and my first summer job was at Queen's Park in Toronto. And in the year that I was taking off, I was working as an assistant to the Minister of Health at Queen's Park. So my experience of Canada had been in Southern Ontario. I attended my first caucus where you had people from across the country, and I discovered that people from Newfoundland or from Quebec or from northern BC had an understanding of Canada that was often profoundly different from mine, but they're every bit as fiercely Canadian as I was. And I felt a sense of astonishment, and then secondly, a sense of anger that I had been able to grow up to that point unaware of my own country, of not having understood the diversity in my own country, and having simply projected my experience from Southern Ontario onto the rest of the country. It's an ongoing problem we have in Canada, that to an extent Southern Ontario is to Canada what the United States is to the world, that people see everybody else based on their own experience. It's not a luxury that people in other parts of Canada have, to assume if you're in Trois-Rivières in Moose Jaw that the rest of the country is exactly the same as what you're experiencing. So for me, as a young person, learning about leadership, learning about Canada, learning about Parliament, this experience with my colleagues in Parliament was a tremendous education. That's a very long answer to a short question, isn't it?
Love it.
This is fantastic. Perrin, you have, and it's quite observable, even in this conversation, but develop a great sense of empathy. The ability to and the desire to learn about other places. And when you recognize just what you described, when you recognize that what your experience and the knowledge that you had up to that point, because of your experiences, were very different than someone else's a bit. You seem to very quickly have a desire to learn more and to embrace that. And we've had lots of opportunities here in recent podcasts to explore the value of having this empathetic characteristic, if you will, this attribute, because most people, when they're looking for leaders, that seems to be the top quality that they're looking for in terms of how they respond to their leaders. Those that are empathetic, willing to engage others that are different than them, have different ideas, to come up with unique tools, unique innovative approaches to solve problems. And do you see a shift today that would cause you concern in terms of how we view, either from a national policy perspective or even in business, where that particular attribute is lacking?
Colin, we always need more of it. I'm not sure that I would say that there's a greater lack of empathy today than there was in the past. We're more tribal than we've been in the past. Unfortunately,
yeah.
Politics has become very tribal, and we tend to choose. I'm on this side of the issue because that's my gang, as opposed to I've chosen my gang based on the issues and on my consideration about who shares the same beliefs that I have and who has worked through these issues and feels the same way. But I think that certainly in business, there's a growing sense that let's start, for example, how do you attract the very best people to your business? How do you hold them? When I was growing up, people looked at joining a company for life, and they stayed there the whole time. That was your goal. Now there's not that attachment to any one job or any one organization. Increasingly, people move around from job to job. So you're an employer. You have to ask yourself, how do I attract the very best people? If you are not empathetic, if you don't understand what they're looking for, then there's always some other employer, there's some other organization out there that would be very pleased to be more responsive than you are. So there's a powerful incentive there. The same way in politics, I think there's no question that we're frustrated when we believe that government isn't listening to us. I was saying to somebody the other day, there are people in Canada who hate the government. They'll always be with us. I worry about that. I hope that percentage doesn't grow. But I'm even more worried about people who believe their government hates them.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where it becomes particularly dangerous, because at that point, people start to opt out of the political system, and they believe that our democratic system isn't functioning, and they start to look at alternatives. It is critical that our elected leaders make it clear that their first function is service. That that when they're elected, the campaign is over, and they're there to serve everybody, not just the people who voted for them. And that for those of us who have the privilege of serving in the House of Commons, that we are a member of a very privileged club, and that we need to leave the institution stronger than we found it, rather than diminishing it and undermining it. Unfortunately, there are too many examples we can all think of where that's not the case, where that's not the motivation, or where that's not what happens. And as a result, then people drift away from their belief in our fundamental institutions. They drift away from their civic engagement with one another. We become more tribal. We become polarized, and we see people who disagree with us as enemies rather than as opponents. And we believe that they're evil rather than mistaken. And there's a big difference between those concepts. So empathy is a critical part. I was at a Canada West Foundation dinner a couple of nights ago, and I was walking back with Ed Fast, Member of Parliament from British Columbia. I didn't have the privilege of serving with Ed in Parliament. He's there now. But we had an interesting conversation. He said to me something that made a lot of sense. He said, to me, the single most important element in choosing a leader or choosing an elected representative is character. And I believe he's absolutely correct in that. So, and I think the public is right when they say, what I'm looking for is, does this person who's a candidate or who's a suggested leader have empathy? I think it's another word for character. And it makes a whole lot of sense. Parliament can last for 4 years between elections. Did anybody anticipate, say 4 years ago, that Russia would be invading Ukraine and that we would be in the sort of dramatically changed world that we're in? Did people anticipate COVID before we saw those first pictures coming out of China and northern Italy? So often the issues that political parties and candidates fight about at election time aren't in fact the great issues that our elected leaders have to deal with. And I don't think the voters are at all wrong in saying it's not necessarily the issue that these guys are squabbling about that I'm paying attention to. I'm interested in the character of the people I'm electing and whether or not they have the capacity to deal effectively with issues that we can't anticipate today and with crises that we can't anticipate, which will go to the very survival of people and to the survival of nations. So empathy, character are the starting point, in my view, more important than experience or even perhaps intellect.
I think was attributed to Dr. King is be more concerned with your character than your reputation, because your character is who you really are, while your reputation is merely what people think of you. And as we're speaking, we are in a society right now. I can't speak for anywhere except the U.S. and Canada, where you have to choose a side. Your comment by people are going to put you on a side. They put you in a box. They isolate you. You're X because you said this or you think this. I think we've had less tolerance for difference and diverse thinking and for different thinking, for being challenged and having our beliefs challenged and having very good productive discourse about social issues and politics, etc. as a leader, how do we try to put this toothpaste back in the tube? Because I think it is a major threat to democracy that we can't have challenging discourse and have beliefs that are different than others. And that's, to me, one of the main premises of a democracy is bringing diversity into play and having a heterogeneous society versus a homogeneous society.
I don't think there's a quick answer, but it starts with how we treat one another. What do you or I look for from other people more than else? We want to be respected. That is, we want people to look at us and say, as a human being, as a citizen, you have a right to your point of view, and you have a right to have me listen to your point of view and to fairly consider it. That's what I would ask, and I think that's what others would ask, including those who've been disenfranchised over the years. You look at Indigenous Canadians who have been left out of the system in so many instances. What's the starting point? It's to treat people with respect and to say you have a voice, it counts, and your opinion is as good and as important as mine. And so the starting point is how we treat one another. One of the things I always admired, I look at the political leaders I've known, and the ones I admire most. Robert Stanfield was my first leader, and he remains my political hero. There was nothing that Stanfield ever said in private that you would have been ashamed of if he had said it in public. He ran out of a sense of duty. He was from a successful business family. He didn't have any need to run, and he didn't feel that the country would fall apart if he didn't become prime minister, nor did he feel that he would fall apart if he didn't become prime minister. But he felt he had a duty of service. He saw it in those terms. It wasn't about what he could get out of it. It was what he could put into it. And that was, for me as a young person, was inspirational to have somebody like that as my leader. Let me take another example. Peter Lougheed, who from Alberta, the Premier of Alberta, I got to know fairly well during the time that we were both in public life, and to admire enormously. The thing that stood out about him and about Bill Davis, who was the Premier of Ontario, was the decency, the innate decency, the fact that they treated others with respect. And even at the height of the National Energy Program, where they, Premier Lougheed was at loggerheads with Prime Minister Trudeau on an issue that had so divided Canada, and where went to the very core of Premier Lougheed's beliefs. The debate was never ad hominem. It was never Mr. Trudeau is evil. It was profoundly disagree with the policies that he's brought down. Peter Lougheed always distinguished between an enemy and an opponent, and he believed that what he was dealing with was an opponent. And he always distinguished between believing that people on the other side were evil. He believed that they were wrong. And there's a
major distinction. That's a major distinction.
If you want to rebuild, Colin, the sense of civic engagement, you start by treating other people with respect. Let me give you an example from my own experience. The element of my political career that's become best known recently is that I was the father of the Emergencies Act, which was invoked for the first time a year ago by the current federal government.
Did anybody give you a cigar for that?
But my experience was with the War Measures Act, which was the predecessor bill, which had been introduced in World War I, which is not a time when, in the middle of a war, when you look at, well, what about the rights of people here? It's how do you increase the power of the state? And it was patterned on a British bill. It was used in World War I incarcerate people who were considered enemy aliens, among other things. It was used in World War II to incarcerate the Japanese. It was used against the Ukrainians as well, and others. Again, it had been used in peacetime only twice, in World War I, World War II, and then Mr. Trudeau Sr. invoked it in the October 1970 crisis, and he did it in response to the kidnapping by the Front de Libération de Québec of Pierre Laporte, who was murdered by his kidnappers. He was the Quebec Labour Minister, and the kidnapping of James Cross, who was the British Trade Commissioner in Montreal. And this was shocking. There had only been one other political assassination in the history of Canada. D'Arcy McGee, who had been one of the fathers of Confederation, who was shot a few blocks from where I am on the Spark Street Mall coming home one night. So shocking, as you can imagine, to people to find that there'd been a political assassination. Mr. Trudeau invoked this nuclear device of the War Measures Act, which suspended civil liberties across Canada, but particularly in Quebec, where you had hundreds of people who were swept up in the dark of night, who were held without habeas corpus, without the right to see a lawyer or to go before the courts or any else, and held without those basic rights that we would expect as a citizen. And the rights of people right across the country were suspended. So you had the mayor of Vancouver, Tom Campbell, talking about using the War Measures Act, that he wanted to use it to clear the hippies out of Gastown. The RCMP came into Guelph, Ontario, beside my hometown of Fergus, because the Guelph student newspaper had done stupid type of thing that student newspapers tend to do, which I can say having worked for one when I was in university. They had reprinted the FLQ manifesto, but this was in Guelph, in English, for student population, and there was no threat to the established order there. But the FLQ manifesto had been banned. The police came in and seized the printing press, the newspaper. So everybody's civil liberties had been suspended. The commitment had been made to take this nuclear device, and ultimately, the killers of Pierre Laporte, the kidnappers of James Cross, were found not through the War Measures Act. Nobody was ultimately convicted of a crime under the War Measures Act. They were found through ordinary police methods and dealt with through ordinary statutes. This had been seared into my conscience. I had supported and participated in a demonstration. I was president of the student PCs at Western. Participated in a demonstration in support of Mr. Trudeau and the government of the day, because Canadians were closing ranks at times of crisis. After this was all over, we all went back to look and say, was there, in fact, the justification for suspending people's civil liberties across the country? Were we right in just trusting implicitly the government that they were doing the right thing? And was the War Measures Act the appropriate piece of legislation? So we were committed to replacing that with modern emergencies legislation that recognized that there could be instances where the government would need to operate very quickly to affect people's rights. For example, the example that my officials used with me was if there were an earthquake in the lower mainland of British Columbia that was so serious that local governments couldn't deal with it, including the government of BC, then the federal government might have to step in, would have to have the power to commandeer private property, to suspend people's rights of mobility and so on, to save people's lives. But there are different types of crises. They could be limited geographically, and the government would need to act quickly. But then, as a quid pro quo for giving them those extraordinary powers, how could you build in checks and balances that would protect people's basic rights and would ensure that Parliament would perform its job of oversight and scrutiny and accountability, that where there's enormous power given to the executive, that there has to be enormous special accountability as well. So this was an extremely contentious bill. I was an Anglophone from Southern Ontario, carrying a bill that was particularly contentious in Quebec because of the experience of the War Measures Act, and was terribly worried that this was going to that if it wasn't handled right, it would divide Canadians instead of uniting them. So the approach that we took, that I took in Parliament, was to say, this is the bill that represents our best effort to meet the needs of the day. But we're going to take our time. We deliberately brought it in when there was no crisis, so that people weren't going to be panicked. They were able to think dispassionately about the issues involved. We said we'll take the time to make sure everybody is heard, and that we'll invite people like the people representing the Japanese community, the Japanese Canadians who've been incarcerated, to hear from them. And that we would look at making changes to the bill where improvements could be made. I believe I saw one thing that said that we had accepted, I think, over 70 amendments from the NDP alone. But the approach was, I instructed my officials that we would look at any proposed amendment to the bill, and unless we had a compelling reason why an amendment couldn't be accepted, we would accept it. That the onus would be on us to explain why an amendment would make things worse as opposed to better. Otherwise, we would accept the proposed amendment. So scores and scores of amendments. Finally, when the bill was presented to the House for third reading, every single member of the House of Commons voted for the bill. It was unanimous. All you have to do is to look back at the newspapers from that day. Parliament wasn't a blissful place where everybody got along well, everything was rosy. This wasn't the golden age of friendship in Parliament. But the experience I had was you treat people with respect, you give them the opportunity to be fairly heard, and adults will respond as adults. They'll respond in kind. That's the way, if in our lives, both either in business or in government or any organization we're in, if your starting point is empathy and understanding and respect, then you'll be surprised by what the results are. Do I believe that we can overcome the polarization we see in society and the division that exists not just in Canada but in every Western democracy? Have we got a quick fix that will correct that? No, we don't. But it won't be corrected unless we start, and it won't be corrected unless somebody's prepared to start with goodwill and with empathy.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of our episode with Mr. Perrin Beatty. Please join us for part 2 as we continue our discussion.